So I'm Janet Froetscher. I run the Pritzker Family Foundation. And as you know, Jack, for 15 years or more, we've been focused on early childhood development because JB and we at the foundation, but also me, I've had a lot of experience in social services. I've never seen anything more powerful in terms of making an impact in children escaping poverty than early childhood development. And as you know, right now, a lot of the rest of the world believes that too, and a lot of that's because of you. You are without any question, if you are in the field, everyone knows that you're the one that's really brought the brain science. Obviously, you're at the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, and you lead that effort. And a lot of where people first heard your name was on the brain science field and being able to take something that was really complicated and explain it to the general public and explain it to legislators. So I would love, since we have you here live, to actually hear the guy that made the world understand the brain science, just hear in your own terms why it's so important and why it's driven so many of us to believe that investing in early childhood is really the way to change the world.
So thank you, Janet. I think you've overstated my role in this.
I actually haven't, but go ahead.
I think I'd like to say from the beginning that I'm a pediatrician, and one of the things a pediatrician has to be able to do is explain complicated things in ways that people can understand to parents.
Well, most of them don't, so I'm glad that you did.
So this is kind of, this is the way it should be. I think there's an interesting story here. If we start with the question of why are the early years so important and what makes us think they're important, there's a basic common sense issue here. I think that most kind of folk wisdom would say, well, what happens early sets a foundation for what happens later.
Although most people think it's babysitting, right? So you just need to make sure they're safe. But you obviously have taught people that it's different.
Well, I've had good material to work with. So before the brain science really exploded, we had a lot of evidence of how early experiences and early influences affect children's learning, their behavior, and in ways that can have a long tail into adolescence and adulthood. What the revolution in neuroscience did, and that started to really accelerate in the last part of the 20th century, 1990s, was the decade of the brain that put a lot of research funds into understanding brain development. And now, for the last 10 or 15 years, it's absolutely exploded, is that we have developed a much deeper understanding of a simple principle. The simple principle is that early experiences shape the development of your brain. It literally shapes the architecture of your brain from the beginning. But what the science has done is it's gone beyond that as just a statement and explained how and why. So what does that mean? And got down to the level of how positive experiences shape the development of the basic circuits and the architecture of the brain. The brain is biologically wired to be shaped by experience. So, in the old days when we used to have these arguments about nature versus nurture, how much is inborn, how much is experience, that is a scientific question that's dead. I mean, what science tells us now is they're highly interrelated. So each of us is born with some kind of genetic predispositions. But how that is expressed is shaped by experience.
So nature feeds nurture and back and forth,
right? Back and forth. And not only do positive experiences build strong brain architecture, but we're understanding at a much deeper level now how serious adversity can disrupt brain circuits and brain architecture early on in life, and also affect a lot of other biological systems that helps us begin to understand why is it that children who grow up in deep poverty experiencing a lot of stress, why children who've been maltreated, children who've been abused or neglected, children living in war zones, why do they have more problems focusing attention, learning, more problems with mental health, physical health as they get older? And the science is opening that up and explaining how that happens. And what that does for our whole sense of, so what should we do about early childhood, is the part of the population that is relatively privileged is using this information, this knowledge, to provide rich experiences for their children to kind of give them a strong foundation. All parents are doing everything they can for their kids, but the part of the population that is struggling to just get by day to day is also trying to find out how to use this knowledge when it's available. but also the knowledge is telling us that stress, that chronic, potentially toxic stress, can disrupt the development of the brain, which basically is opening up a whole new way of thinking about what can we do to promote healthy development and effective learning. And what that's done, here's some of the things that science is leading us to think in a different way. We know that enriched experiences are important for children's learning, particularly language exposure, which is a foundation for later literacy. So what the science is saying is that's right, it's absolutely right, but at the same time, excessive stress activation disrupts circuits in the brain that relate to being able to focus your attention, control your impulses, follow directions.
Those social emotional skills
all of
that
those
are
things.
important for work and life and learning.
Absolutely. Early learning, being ready to succeed in school, do well in school, do well in life. And so here's one very concrete example. Science is saying, yes, enriched experiences are very important early on. But for children who are living in very adverse circumstances, you won't get the benefits of the enriched experiences entirely unless you also figure out how to protect the developing brain from the disruptions of chronic stress activation.
So what you were able to articulate for folks, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that those first 3 years in particular are really important, right? Those are the kind of, and what happens.
Tremendously important.
So they are, you've said, that's the bricks and mortar of the brain. That's where the foundation's formed for all learning skills later in life, right? The social emotional skills building block. And it's actually those connections of the neuron that happen, right? That's what I think I've learned from you, right?
That's right.
And if you can make that happen, you can build all the rest on later on. I think what's interesting about listening to your work is it's not necessarily that complicated in terms of what we're looking for. When you say rich in learning experiences, you've talked a little in the past about it being this kind of back and forth relationship between a parent and a child. So at its heart, it's really that interaction between the caring adult and the child, and the back and forth connection between them. I'm probably not explaining it well.
No, you're explaining it perfectly well. In fact, this is built into our biology. If you think about it, and a lot of basic principles of brain development are the same in all animal species. I mean, human brains, there are things that are different about a human brain from other animals for sure, but a lot of brain development is the same across all species. And one thing that's really clear is that humans are more helpless for a longer period of time after birth. So for most animals, this kind of what we call serve and return interaction, it's a relatively short period of time. Animals are up on their own, and they're in their adolescence in months, could be weeks. Humans take years. Some people might say decades before they're off on their own, right? But the one thing we do know is that in infancy, if there isn't highly attentive, responsive interactions, a baby will die.
Right.
I mean, you have to be fed.
Right.
You have to, if you're in pain, somebody has to respond to that. So built into our biology, because it takes so long to be independent, the end result is we can do more things than other animals can, but it takes a long time to get there. So built into the biology is that a lack of responsiveness is life-threatening. It activates all kinds of stress response systems that are intended to basically engage adults to meet basic needs. And that system of stress response is a good thing to have. It's life-saving. But that system was not meant to be activated most of the time.
Right,
and when it's activated most or all of the time, it actually has a wear and tear effect on the body. This is biologically, we understand that at the molecular level. Your grandmother could have told you that all that stress can't be good for you, right? I mean, it's all coming to the same thing. So the brain is expecting responsiveness, and when it doesn't get it, it activates the stress systems. And so just understanding that and understanding, we've learned a lot of this, not just from basic brain research, but studies of children in very extremely, adverse circumstances, like the Bucharest, Romanian orphanage study is one of the best known. So that's the point. Here's an example of the reason that brain architecture is so dependent on positive experience, is it's expecting it.
Right.
It's expecting it. Genetically, it's expecting it. And when it doesn't get it, that's danger.
Right. But to me, I'm a practitioner. I'm someone who's been focused my life, as you have, on how we create a better environment, a better world. You know, we know there are millions of children who are going to start school not ready to learn, and who, quite frankly, don't have a fair chance to be able to make it up because of what you just described. And what's so interesting about the brain science and why it's driven so many people into the early learning field is what you've been able to take into practice is that if we can create those kinds of serve and return relationships, that loving, caring, responsive adult to a child, we can actually help them form a solid foundation so that they can have those social and emotional skills and the learning and the behavior change going forward. And it drives higher earnings, it drives higher graduation rates, it drives lower incarceration rates, it drives, you know,
less health problems, less disease.
Significant less health problems. Yep. So we now know as a field that the earlier we invest, particularly the first 3 years, allows us to generate stronger, more productive adults and also incur far less costs as a society. So it's a literal example of brain science driving huge change forever for millions of children in this world.
It's exactly right, Janet. And in fact, when you've talked about the building blocks and the foundations, those are also the building blocks of resilience. They are building the capacity, because the goal is not to make sure children don't experience stress. That stress is a normal part of life. The goal is to have the stress be manageable in a way that doesn't overwhelm your biological systems and allows you to build your own capacities to deal with stress on your own. Right. In the beginning, babies depend upon adults. And this other, so yes, it's a fact. I mean, it's a scientific fact that what happens early on really lays the groundwork. At the same time, what we have to help people understand is at one point, there was an overcorrection in the past where people talked about the window closing at age 3. Right. And it's too late. That's not true. That's absolutely not true. But it's completely true that it gets harder as you wait. And
far more
expensive,
less effective. Right.
You work harder, you pay more, and you get a less better outcome than you would get if you had done it right the first time.
So your being able to explain the science has led to a lot of bipartisan support and public will to invest in the earliest stages. I think we're seeing it play out in a political environment where we're seeing this heavy drive to pre-K as, okay, we've solved it if we solve pre-K. And also we're seeing in another related kind of part of our lives, this drive to affordable childcare, because we know now that women and men are working but what hasn't kind of gotten into people's consciousness is that childcare, that babysitting is actually those early learning experiences. And that what we've got to do is change the debate into a real continuum of quality learning experiences from birth to 5. But what's also, I think, what we've got to kind of, if we really want to take it to the next level, is we've got to use what you're seeing now in science to drive what that looks like. So we know it's important, we know it's highly impactful, but to go to real scale, we've got to figure out what's working for whom so we can really drive the interventions the way they're going to make sense. So brain science is also going to help us, this kind of leading edge brain science is also starting to tell us a little bit about what those interventions need to look like for who, right?
No, I think that's exactly right. And there's been a natural evolution of this in the early years when the public started to become more aware of the basic principles. The purpose of translating the brain science was to help people understand why the programs we have right now are important and why quality matters.
Why we should invest there versus later in prisons and job training programs and everything else.
And how they're related.
Exactly.
So that was a very powerful influence that brain science had early on that resulted in now much broader kind of, beyond partisan politics, understanding and support for investment. Now, although there's still parts of the population that maybe don't know this, and there's always more
10 to 20%, not a lot, but they don't understand the first 3 years.
Right. So now that's exactly right. So that gets to the question of now, is there another role for science aside from just saying, hey, the early years are important? And that's where there's a tremendously powerful role of science to say, not only are they important, and this is why they're important, but here are some insights that we are gathering from as we look at how experience gets into the body that could generate some new ideas about what we might do in our service systems, what we might do in our policies that would have an even greater impact than what we're having right now. And that's, I think we're at a critical transition point for that.
Where we could take science to practitioners and learn from that to then take it to public policy.
Exactly.
And that's what you're trying to do in the frontiers of innovation, right?
Yes,
you're
exactly.
trying to put in one place what comes out as science, work with practitioners who can then take that science and modify their programs and make some breakthrough with their programs and try some things. And then when we see kind of what's working for who, start to very quickly blend that into policy change, right?
Precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. You know, I mean, another way to put it on a bumper sticker is, you know, in the beginning when brain science became more kind of available, the question we were addressing is why? Why should we invest in the early childhood years? The next question, once people understood the why, natural thing was to say, well, so what should we do?
Right.
I mean, and that moved from the brain science to the science of intervention and the science of what we know about policies. And so, and that what question is still a question that a lot of people are interested in asking. What Frontiers of Innovation is interested in doing now is building on the answer to the why and the answer to the what, or the how do we do it, to the next big question, which is what's next. And that's the exciting frontier, what's next, as opposed to let's just keep doing the things we're doing. But some of the things we're doing are working beautifully for some part of the population, just keep doing it. But there's a part of the population for whom what we're doing is not enough, or we may not even be reaching them. And this is where what's next, grounded in science, not just what people, you know, kind of intuitively think. Putting the two together, it can be very powerful.
So I think, you know, I think we all agree that this is a time, we're the times now, right, where we literally have millions of children who don't have a fair chance. And where we know enough from a brain science point of view to be able to really make an impact. And where we finally have some political will to do it. So I think now more than any time is the time where we need to bring the scientists and the practitioners and the advocates together with the people who really run those systems to make that change and see if we can take advantage of it in this environment we have with rapid change. So I know we really look forward to continuing the dialogue and to working with you as you do that, and I hope we can convince lots of other folks from walks of life to be able to do that, because we have the opportunity right in front of us to actually change the world in a very significant way.
I think that's absolutely correct. I really believe that. You know, and I just want to pick up on the last thing you said. When you started to list the people who need to be brought to the table, and then you added the people involved in the systems, the delivery systems. Right. So I think in many ways, this is the key to an innovation approach to scale, which is not, so how are we going to come up with some really cool, creative, brilliant new idea that's going to change the world? And then how are we going to do it?
Okay, good luck on that.
Yeah.
Right.
It's what we have to do is we have systems in place. We have infrastructure in place. We have delivery channels that are already serving large numbers, if not almost the entire population. And what we need to do is have our innovation fit into addressing identified challenges or problems in those systems for which we need new ideas, not a whole new set of programs, a whole new set of systems. And this is where, again, borrowing from the innovation world in business, is the new interventions, practices, need to, at least a good hunk of them, need to be modularized. They need to be not, here's a program with multiple parts, do this instead of what you're doing. Here are the kinds of things you can incorporate into the healthcare system, into childcare programs, into early education programs, not just for the sake of let's do something else, but because they're specifically targeted to a challenge you've identified, whether it be an area of development you're just not really making enough progress on, or some subgroup that you're not reaching that aren't having their needs addressed by this. And I think that's the way we'll be able to scale faster. Right. And we can scale in a more targeted fashion.
And create the system change we need for scale.
Absolutely.
Well, we look forward to continuing to work with you, and I hope we can get others to our calls.
I've enjoyed this conversation very much.
Me too, Jack. Thanks.
Thank you.